Okay, hi everyone, thanks for being here. Today I'm going to be talking about a bit of a think project that Josh and I have been working on since last year's CAG, or last year's AAG I suppose, so about a year and a bit, when we realized that we had some similar interests around some of the conceptual issues surrounding the legal geographies of waste in Canadian cities. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this project is developing, and then I'm going to invite Josh to come up so we can answer questions together. Yeah, so we wanted to start by talking about some of the mental geographies of waste that are quite pervasive in our cultural context. So I think if you've been here for a number of the sessions today, you will have heard this mantra of sight, out of mind. This is a big part of our mental geography that a lot of times we don't even think about waste until we're forced to, until it's right in front of our faces, which in a way connects to the idea of waste as an absence. So we often notice it, or we don't notice it, and when we do notice it, we talk about how waste is connected to valuelessness. These are resources that don't have any monetary value. They may have reduced personal, social, symbolic value, less potential in terms of material cycles, for example. So this persistent absence, this strangely absent presence, right? So this borderline of visibility and invisibility, which also leads to a potential for us to understand waste as a very liminal concept. It's at this cusp of becoming and unbecoming. It's the in-between world between production, consumption, disposal. In a way, waste is a palimpsest. It's something that has had value laid over it and then erased multiple times. And again, this goes back to some of the earlier presentations that we had about beginnings and endings, Josh's earlier work about the cyclical nature of this amorphous idea, this collection of objects that somehow gets termed waste. And the liminality also leads to understanding waste as a borderlands. So this could be, again, symbolic, cultural, the in-betweenness, but also, because we're all geographers, it's a very spatial construct. So waste is something that we place at the edge of our property to be picked up by garbage, something that we put at the edge of our cities underneath the ground. Right? So in a lot of spatial ways, it also occupies this in-between place. So I wanted to give you a sense of some of the in-betweenness, some of the gray zones that waste is connected to in our social lives. So these are some of the questions that I wrote into our abstract. Are freegans thieves, right? People living off of dumpsters to feed themselves, are they breaking the law? Are the police allowed to sort through your garbage on your personal private land in order to find evidence? Is that legal? And to sort of change the framing of this conversation, as the guardians of public health in cities, what rights do municipal authorities have to access and manage waste products? So it's not just about personal rights to access trash or to be able to protect your own private property. Municipality has a set of responsibilities for managing waste. This is very much in line with what Max was talking about, right? So what rights accompany that set of responsibilities as well? So how do these different rights and responsibilities touch up against each other in terms of law and also in terms of spaces of the cities? So what we're arguing, hopefully in this presentation, is that an analysis of the ways that waste is legally treated and regulated can provide insight to some of the ongoing social constructions of both the public good and the public sphere. Right, so where those boundaries of what the public sphere is as opposed to the private sphere. And also where jurisdiction begins and ends. So if we think of jurisdiction as this spatially bound authority of the law, then the practice of law tells us a lot about where that sphere begins and ends. And a point that I want to make before getting into some of the examples is that these are not codified one-time interventions. We often think of the law as something that's written down and then everybody knows the rules. Here they are, go out and behave according to them. But in actuality, these are performed. They are reenacted through multiple series of different types of laws that overlap in different jurisdictions, through the day-to-day regulation of waste and wasting behaviors, through policing, through choices about when to police and when not to police, when to enforce, when to fine, when not to fine. So these are regularly enacted, performed social agreements. So in working through this project, we're drawing very much on legal geography. And so the main contribution that I think we want to nod to here is that legal geographers have helped us to understand the ways that law and space are mutually constitutive. So that law is not an aspatial social practice. It creates new social relationships through the way that it enacts cities and city spaces, and that those city spaces also relate to the ways that the laws can be laid out. So some examples. Nick Blomley's works around the regulation of sidewalks and public flow. So what people are allowed to do on sidewalks, how long you're allowed to stand there, whether or not you can put an object down. And again, who gets policed in doing those things, right? If it's your Holt Renfrew bag that's sitting on the sidewalk, is it going to be policed the same way as a shopping cart full of cans? Don Mitchell's work around anti-homelessness and the regulation of space. So again, a way to regulate the users and the uses by trying to legally intervene in the spaces that are often the sites for those users and uses. Lynn Stahelli and Don Mitchell's work describing how access to private property actually gives people access to the public sphere. And I would suggest too that their work around malls and the policing that happens in semi-private places like that also has a lot to do with understanding the relationship between society, space, and the law. But I think that, Tim Cresswell's work, I put him in brackets because I don't think he would call himself a legal geographer, but the work that he does particularly around things like graffiti also very much connect into this conversation of law and space. But the contribution that we want to make here, so we're very much drawing on these authors and the ideas that they have brought to the forefront. But I think the point that we're trying to make is that in actuality, waste is not just a site, right? It's not just a space. There is a space that belongs to waste, but there's also something about this particularly nebulous object that in itself can tell us something about the ways we regulate life. So waste is an important site and object for understanding the legal construction of public norms and spaces. So this process, the mutual constitution of law and space, is mediated and influenced when it is in conversation with waste objects. So we've been mostly talking about this work within the Canadian legal context to put some bounded scope to it. We've been looking at court cases, municipal bylaws, which are often seated in provincial law, and then practices of policing. So we've been doing searches in municipal bylaws, we've been searching court cases, we've been searching newspapers for discussions of policing and regulation. And we started in the places that we know best. So we started in places where we had personal experiences, where we've been living and working. And you heard Josh mention earlier Donna Haraway's methodological discussion of attachment sites. So basically this is an idea of entanglement. And Haraway talks about where the sticky knots are. So basically saying these are the places, these are the sites where we have people, places, technology, landscapes all coming together to create these really interesting problems, which is basically my theoretical justification for cherry picking the examples that we're going to talk about. So these are the sticky knots, right? These are two of the stickiest knots that I want to talk about. However, there are a number of other sites and knots, so I will give a nod to some of the broader trends of what we're seeing in those court cases and newspaper stories that we're finding. But I want to talk to you a little bit about a watershed Supreme Court case from 2009, and also the ways that informal recycling has been regulated in 3 different Canadian cities. So this is an answer to one of the questions on one of my earlier slides. Are the police allowed to go onto your private property and search through the trash and find evidence against you? Yes, they can. If you have put it out, if it can be assumed that it is trash, then it belongs in the public sphere, and the police can go into your trash. And so this case came about, it was, the incident was in Calgary, and it was somebody who's running an ecstasy lab, and the police had reason to believe this and went into the garbage and found gloves and duct tape and empty plastic bags with little bits of residue, and then that was enough information for them to then get a warrant. So then the reason that this went all the way to the Supreme Court was there was a conversation about, is this an unfair search and seizure? Does this basically trample on somebody's civil liberties? And the answer is no, it doesn't. This is completely reasonable. So I want to give you an excerpt from the decision with some interesting points. So P abandoned his privacy, Patrick, in the interest of, in the information, but he placed the garbage bags for collection at the back of his property. He had done everything required of him to commit the bags to the municipal collection system. So I want to give you, I want to highlight a couple of things here. In the teal is a discussion of public good, I think, right? So we're seeing that when Patrick put this waste out, it could have been accessed by anybody, right? It could have been accessed by street people, bottle pickers, urban foragers, nosy neighbors, all the mischievous children, dogs, assorted wildlife, and then therefore also garbage collectors and the police. If all these other people can use it in these questionable, potentially socially illegitimate ways, then of course garbage collectors and the police can when there's a greater public good, right? So we're getting this sort of sense of hierarchy and allusion to public good. And the other point that I want to mention here is this word abandonment that's used multiple times in this decision. And when we hear discussion of abandonment, how Patrick abandoned his waste, I think this sort of, for me, evokes like Elizabethan times when people would just toss their waste into the Thames and la-di-da, forget about it. What this terminology is actually doing is obfuscating an important social relationship, right, where this citizen had entrusted his waste to the municipal system. There was a social contract here of I pay property taxes, you take my waste away. There's an expected chain of control, a chain of material flow, right? A certain expected metabolism to where this waste was going to go. So in a way, this, I think, is part of what the argument in the court is about, too. It's a sense of broken trust. And I mean, this is for those of you who have done, so I was recently telling some of you about how we've been doing garbage audits in Guelph, and it's unbelievable to see how upset people get when you start going through their garbage, right? There's this real proprietorness about it, because that's a private relationship between me and the municipality. It's not public. I didn't put it out there for everybody, even if it is technically on the borderline of public. So trying to understand these boundaries and when it's legitimate to cross them and when it's not. And I want to give you an example of how this same legal principle was employed in a completely different way in a different case. It was mobilized to justify a different public good. So this is a case of a well-known union, Unite Here. It's a hospitality services housekeeping union in a lot of big cities in North America. And this case is in St. Catharines, Ontario. So what happened in this case was a known union organizer, somebody who's working on the housekeeping staff, so there's a long chain of information that shows that the employer knew that this person was doing union organization, took a pay stub of somebody who was one of the executive staff out of the garbage to go back and to show the union the discrepancy in the pay rates between different employees in the same corporation, and was then summarily fired for breaking confidentiality. Right? And so what the judgment showed was that actually, no, it was completely legitimate that that pay stub was taken out of the garbage. It had been abandoned, even though this is very clearly, it was a sub-private space, right? It was an office on a private piece of land. It was in no way put out at the curbside. Right? There's no boundary there. But this argument was mobilized to say that in actuality what had happened was an unfair discriminatory firing, right? So it was a protection of the labor rights of this individual. So again, we're seeing really different mobilizations of the same legal principles and similar jurisdiction. So I'm going to talk briefly about informal recycling. And bylaws are generally, so this is a municipally defined legal sort of network that we're talking about. Many bylaws in Canada prohibit scavenging, as it's called. However, enforcement is difficult and infrequent, so we don't often see it. We don't see people being thrown in jail or fined often for it. I'm going to give you some examples of 3 different cities. In Toronto, the conversation is very much about millions of dollars lost by the municipality. So this is this narrative of people stealing from the trash. That the municipality could make money if things weren't being taken out of the garbage. So this particular story and moment in this regulation comes after, for those of you from Ontario, it comes after the provincial government says that they're going to put a deposit return system on wine bottles in addition to beer bottles. So the municipality was saying, well, now that there's so much more incentive for people to start going through the garbage and taking all this glass out of our system, this precious, precious glass, and in actuality, they don't make a lot of money off of the system. We're losing millions of dollars. So it's an economic argument, and it appealed to that greater good. But part of why we see such low enforcement, I think, is that there's a counter-narrative around who the people are who are taking from the waste, right? And that these are very publicly observable figures of low-income people and a lot of people who are elderly and of ethnic backgrounds that are more marginalized in the city, right? So we're seeing people who we're very happy to give their bottles to on an interpersonal level, and so it's a fine balance in this system. Contrast this with a historical moment, so I'm very clear to point out this is in 2006 and it's now a different mayor in Vancouver. Sam Sullivan's Project Civil Society initiatives to try to pass a bylaw to lock all of the dumpsters in Vancouver to make sure that binners, informal recyclers as they're known locally, couldn't get into the dumpsters. And this is very much the public good in this case is an anti-nuisance bylaw. So for aesthetic purposes and very much in up-and-coming and affluent neighborhoods wanting to make sure that there wasn't garbage and 8,000 syringes in the alleyways, right? And I mean, there could be a conversation about what's really causing garbage and what's causing there to be 8,000 syringes in the back alley, but that's not part of this conversation, right? It's because the dumpsters aren't locked. It's not because of rampant poverty or addiction or insufficient public health access to addiction services, for example. So this was a flash in Vancouver's history. This kind of bylaw was attempted 3 times. It didn't pass, but very much we can see this rhetoric around trying to regulate the informal recycling system. This in contrast to an article that Virginia recently sent me from Kitchener about scrappers scouring the curbside garbage, how this is a lucrative and legal activity. Right? And so the article goes on to talk about how this is a stigmatized activity, but in actuality how it's increasing waste diversion, how it's an environmental good and a social good. So we're seeing really different framings of the public good in this case. And again, that boundary, that gray zone in between the public and private space, the sphere. So I've given you a few examples. There are a number of different ways that law is mobilized to enact relationships between different parties through waste. So mitigating nuisance, facilitating service provision, so enabling the garbage to be collected and the recycling to be collected, controlling and capturing material flows, so again, making sure that recyclables don't go to landfill, making sure that the municipality can capitalize, or in some cases, private companies can capitalize on those recyclables. We also see attempts for the government to make individual citizens more visible and legible, so by more readable, to make the evidence of their, in some cases, DNA and evidence of wrongdoing more available. But we also see the flip side of that of protecting privacy and protecting identities. There are a lot of new regulations and laws being enacted to prevent identity theft from people going through other people's trash. And also there are some attempts to balance these individual freedoms with the public goods. Right? So finding ways to mediate these differences. So in some of the points that I'm hoping you'll be able to take away from our presentation, the public sphere and public good, these are not static. These are iterative social constructions that are constantly being reenacted, and in the public sphere, waste is one important medium for that constitution. The legalities of waste are changing, shifting, and overlapping. So with respect to e-waste, Josh has previously written about how jurisdiction is multiple, distributed, and patchy. So we see the importance of place and space in looking at legalities of waste. Waste problematizes seemingly binary categorizations like public and private, also formal and informal through this example, right? Like you keep regulating informal recycling, at what point is it no longer informal? And you also heard Josh earlier allude to the politics of what. So this is Maul's discussion of how objects have multiplicity within them, how there are multiple relationships, and how there are many situated practices that enable and enact that existence. So again, I think that sort of the idea of the palimpsest, I think waste is a key candidate for that description. Thank you for your time, and if we have a couple minutes, to answer questions.